Pycha-Holst from Solidarity Realty is going to talk to us about Avigation easements, local economic impact, and property values. And I was grateful to hear from Jesse a few months ago when the City County Homeless Issues Committee took on this issue, and heard from a number of panelists. And that's something that I take really seriously because I'm a housing lawyer, and I know and have represented a number of people that live in low-income areas around Truax. And I know that in this city and in this county, we do not have meaningful housing choice. People do not have many housing options. And when we have a proposal like this that will disproportionately impact people that already have a really tough time looking for housing and accessing housing, and we're going to further destabilize folks who are already struggling to make ends meet. I think it's really unconscionable. And I think that's why the City County Homeless Issues Committee spoke out strongly, and I believe unanimously, against the F-35 sighting and communicated that to Senator Baldwin and the congressional delegation. So anyway, I'm glad that you'll get a chance now to hear from Jesse about the impact on home values and residents in the area.
Thanks for coming. Seems every time we have one of these, it snows heavily. We should have them more often. Easements and property values. So, as Alder Kemble mentioned, there's these easements that exist. Most of these were sold before Dane County Regional Airport was expanded in the 90s. So, as you know, an easement is an agreement between two parties for some shared use of property. Mostly we think of as driveways, right? And the Avigation easement, which, by the way, I did not know Avigation was even a word. I just kept thinking it was a typo. That is when a property owner has one of these easements, but it's about the sound quality, the sound space above and around their home. And most of these were sold in the 90s for about $2,000 a piece. And that precludes, the homeowner from making any claim, or at least the reason for it. And there's a whole, I am not a lawyer, so there's a whole host of legal arguments to be made back and forth. But from what I understand, talking with Heidi before this event, is that it is the opinion of Dane County Regional Airport's lawyer that this precludes a homeowner who has one of these from making any kind of claim for monetary compensation, these alleged soundproofing programs that don't yet exist, regardless of any future changes to the sound space above your home, types of aircraft changing, the number of flights, and use of afterburners. And we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Here on the left is the sound map that was in the EIS. You'll see there's a color gradient that gets louder and louder as you get closer and closer to the runway. The takeaway here is that outer line is what they're calling a 65 DNL, right? So that's inside of that, they're saying this is what would cause or what would trigger a homeowner to start to apply to any benefits that might be afforded at some point in the future, maybe. Now, our firm has done some research for homes in and around that 65 decibel zone to see where these easements exist. And where we found them is actually right here. You can't see it, right to the south, where that southern tip of that sound contour juts out. And you can see these are all the little homes on the right-hand side in green that have these easements. People who probably need the most protection from this dangerously high level of noise. So these easements are meant to preclude a homeowner from making a monetary claim, and we found over 400 Avigation easements in total. And that is, and this is a very, all the estimates that we use in any kind of our methodology are meant to be very conservative, so that they're unassailable. They're usually, in reality, probably much higher, but this is at least $100 million of residential property that holds these easements. Now, 65 DNL, well, the words that you hear a lot, incompatible for residential use, that's a designation, that's a verbiage used by the U.S. Air Force. So that's not something that we're just throwing out there. This level as threshold is commonly used metric to decide what homeowners would have a potential long-term hearing loss risk. And to help determine, when there are these kind of block grants, depending state by state, what the situation looks like to distribute any potential federal money, who would get it maybe. It does not mean uninhabitable. It doesn't mean that the city would say you can't go back into your home, whether that's good or bad. It just means that there's this higher recognized elevated risk. And just because it's 65 DNL, that doesn't mean, we think of decibels what's the highest level usage. This is a day-night average between the highest event and the dead of night. So in this zone, you'll still commonly experience sounds well above 100 decibels. So that's the DNL, is that average. SEL, single event level, that's what we think of when we think decibels. That's when you turn on, your vacuum cleaner and it's getting to 80, 85 decibels or so, or somebody's shouting at 100 or 110, right? And just to give you some clue, because I know this is very opaque and I'm not going to get deep into the science behind decibels, we think, gosh, 50 decibels, 100 decibels must be twice as high, and that's not the case. It's a logarithmic scale. So 53 decibels is actually double the sound of 50 decibels. Every 10 decibels of increase is about 3 to 4 times louder than the previous 10. So for example, a loud motorcycle might be around 95. This is off the CDC's website, by the way. And you can see hearing loss. That's not saying that that's going to be blood-curdling ear pain, because a lot of hearing loss is very slow and subtle and not noticed until you're exposed to this kind of stuff for years. I don't know how many of you have worked in a concert venue for many years, but you'll realize that maybe you should have been wearing those earplugs like your managers told you. Yeah, so a loud concert venue might be 110 decibels, or standing next to sirens from a fire truck that drives by can be 120 decibels. These are the kind of peak levels that we're anticipating, and unfortunately, were not included in the EIS report that was sent out to the public from the Air Force. So this can be, from a from a real estate perspective, this kind of notice given to us by a government agency is what we would construe as a defect. And it's something that even if you don't know as a homeowner when you're trying to sell your home, it is something that a licensee that helps you sell that, or if you're trying to sell on your own, that the buyer's agent should be picking up on, because they're reasonably expected to know these things about real estate in that area. So here's again that proposed sound map. This again is the DNL. Now what this does not, and nowhere in the report does it show, is that SEL level, which is a little bit more concerning when we're trying to think about who gets hearing loss and when. So we looked, our firm, Solidarity, looked at the EIS that was put out in the fall, late summer, fall, and we said, okay, missing from this conversation, how much real estate are we even talking about here that's inside that line? So we totaled it up. We poured over all the 2019 tax assessments, and I want to stress that's not market value, right? When we think about property value, I think about 3 legs of a stool, right? There's market value, which is what anyone is willing to pay for a home, and then there's tax assessment, which is different, and then there's the bank appraisal. Now these 3 values are usually moored together somewhat, loosely tethered, but they're not identical. And in Dane County, the tax assessment is usually less than the market value. So again, a conservative estimate. And we came up with $255 million of residential real estate that is going to have this designation as incompatible for residential use. The EIS suggests that there's 1,300 households that will experience this designation, and when we went over the tax records, we were able to identify 819 actual residences, so there's potentially many more out there. And to wrap up, when we're comparing, what are going to be all policy has winners and losers, and anytime that, if any of you have reached out to Senator Baldwin's office to ask her why she's supporting this, and what we've heard back time and time again is that there is $100 million in a UW study of economic activity due to Truax field. And I just want to quickly dispel a couple of myths about that. because they keep calling it a UW study to kind of lend the imprimatur of UW-Madison, when this was a UW extension, and not to poo-poo the folks who study at the UW extension, but it's not the same thing as UW-Madison. We should just make that distinction clear. And this study was funded by Scott Walker's WEDC, which was the replacement for the Department of Commerce, right? So just so we know kind of where these numbers are coming from, and Senator Baldwin's office claims support based almost exclusively on this figure. So it's important to kind of suss these numbers out. That $100 million, if you read the study, it's about 30 pages long, maybe a paragraph per page. It's not too dense and it's not hard to get through. That's for all federal dollars being sent back to Wisconsin via Truax. So that is airmen's salaries. That's also contractors on base. There are several branches on the base that operate, not just the Air National Guard. There's the Army National Guard, as we just heard earlier. The U.S. Air Force is actually operating out of there, right? So that is all the bases. I also want to stress that what's being insinuated here is that if we don't get these F-35s, that nice shiny $100 million will go away. And that's not the case at all. So we need to be really clear about that. In order to close or relocate a military base, it has to go through a process called BRAC. It's the Base Relocation and Closure. It's a typically multi-year process that involves coordination between the Pentagon and Congress, which you can imagine is slightly bureaucratic. Nowhere in that report does it say that $100 million stays local. So when they're buying light bulbs, they're not getting that from the local hardware store. When they're getting food for the mess hall, that's not coming from a Dane County farmer's market. And as last I was aware, we don't make replacement jet parts anywhere in Wisconsin. So there's no actual verification that any of that money is destined and guaranteed to stay here in Dane County. Also, that is not the net impact, it's the gross number of federal dollars coming in. And the report itself does say that does not cover the opportunity cost. What would we do if we were to get that money to do some other social program that would create some economic benefit? What would happen if Truax were to close entirely and we turned it into another college or an expansion of Madison College, something like that. That is a gross number, not a net number. With that, I will turn it back over to Heidi.